A poor street vendor was just trying to make an honest living when two arrogant police officers decided to harass, humiliate, and arrest him. They shoved him, knocked over his cart, and handcuffed him like a criminal, all because they thought he was just another powerless nobody. But what they didn't know, they had just made the biggest mistake of their careers, because the man they thought was just a simple vendor was hiding a secret that would flip their world upside down. What happens when the ones enforcing the law realize they just arrested the wrong person? Stay with me, because this story is about to take an unforgettable turn. Have you ever seen someone underestimate the wrong person? Tell us in the comments, because by the end of this story, those officers will regret everything. The city was alive with movement. Cars honked, people rushed down the sidewalks, and vendors stood by their carts calling out to customers. The smell of freshly baked bread, grilled meat, and spices filled the air. Among them, a middle-aged man worked quietly at his small food cart. His cart wasn't fancy, just a simple metal stand with a grill, a few trays, and a cash box. But it was his livelihood. He had been in this spot for years, selling food to workers, students, and anyone passing by. His hands moved with practiced ease, flipping bread, slicing meat, and carefully wrapping orders. His clothes were simple, worn but clean. His face had lines of experience, but his eyes carried a sense of quiet patience. He wasn't a loud man. He didn't argue or draw attention to himself. He just worked hard and minded his own business. But not everyone respected vendors like him. All around him, other vendors were at work. Some sold fruit, some had carts filled with drinks, and others made small crafts. They had all learned to keep their heads down and avoid trouble. But there was always trouble. The street vendors never felt completely safe. They knew that at any moment, someone could come and try to shut them down. It didn't matter if they had permits. It didn't matter if they were following the rules. All it took was the wrong officer on the wrong day. And today was that day. Two police officers walked down the sidewalk, their steps slow and purposeful. They weren't here to protect anyone. They were here to remind people who had power. These officers were well known in the area, not for keeping order, but for abusing it. They didn't chase down criminals. They didn't stop real threats. Instead, they picked on the easy targets, the vendors, the workers, the people who couldn't afford to fight back. One of the officers, Tanner, spotted the vendor at his cart. He smirked. He nudged his partner, Mills, and muttered something under his breath. Mills chuckled. They had found their next target. The vendor continued working, unaware of what was coming. He carefully wrapped a sandwich, handed it to a waiting customer, and wiped his hands on a cloth. He had seen officers like them before. He knew how they operated. But he wasn't afraid. Not yet. The other vendors noticed the officers immediately. Their reactions were instinctive. Some began packing up their things, quickly tucking away their products. Others simply turned their backs, pretending not to see what was about to happen. They had seen this play out too many times. The police would find a vendor, harass them, push them around, maybe destroy their cart, and leave them with nothing. And there was nothing anyone could do about it. Or so they thought. The vendor didn't pack up. He didn't turn away. He kept working, kept moving, kept calm. But deep down, he knew. This time, it wasn't just another random stop. This time, everything was about to change. The vendor continued his work, wrapping another sandwich as he heard a sharp voice behind him. License, now! He didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The street grew quieter, other vendors lowering their heads, some packing up quickly to avoid trouble, These officers weren't new to the area. They came often, looking for easy targets, people they could intimidate, push around, humiliate. Slowly, the vendor turned and faced the two uniformed men standing in front of his cart. Officer Tanner, a broad-shouldered man with a smug smirk, stood with his hand resting on his belt. Officer Mills, slightly shorter but just as arrogant, stood beside him, scanning the cart like a predator eyeing prey. "Let's go," Tanner said again, tapping his foot impatiently. "Show me your papers." The vendor didn't argue. He calmly reached into his pocket and handed over a neatly folded permit. Tanner barely glanced at it before scoffing. "This looks fake," he muttered, crumpling the paper in his fist. The vendor's expression didn't change. "It's real," he said evenly. Mills let out a chuckle and shook his head. "Buddy, this doesn't mean anything." He took the crumpled permit and without a second thought, tossed it onto the ground. The vendor inhaled slowly, his eyes flicking toward the discarded paper, then back to the officers. "You just destroyed my permit." His voice was steady, measured. Tanner shrugged, smirking. "What permit?" Mills stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on the cart. "Maybe we should shut this operation down." Before the vendor could react, Mills deliberately knocked over a tray of food. Bread, grilled meat, and fresh vegetables tumbled onto the pavement. Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. A few customers took cautious steps back, whispering among themselves, but no one stepped in. They had seen this before. They knew how it ended. Tanner leaned in, his voice dripping with mockery. "You got a problem with that?" The vendor didn't move. His gaze remained locked onto Tanner's, unreadable. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something else, something calm, something controlled, and that's when the air around them changed. Mills felt it first. The way the vendor stood. The way he didn't flinch or argue. The way he remained still, not in hesitation, but in certainty. There was something different about him, something unsettling. But Tanner didn't notice. He was too busy enjoying himself. With a quick movement, Tanner grabbed the vendor's wrist and twisted his arm behind his back. "Enough games," he muttered. "You're coming with us." The vendor let out a slow breath. Then, in a voice so quiet and composed that it sent chills down Mill's spine, he asked, "Are you sure you want to do this?" Tanner scoffed, tightening his grip. "What's that supposed to mean? You think you get a choice?" The vendor exhaled, his jaw clenching slightly. "I'm giving you one last chance. Let me go." Mills chuckled darkly. "And what if we don't?" The vendor's eyes darkened. "Then you're going to regret it." Tanner rolled his eyes. "Yeah? And why's that?" The vendor didn't answer. Because soon enough, they were about to find out. Tanner yanked the vendor forward and slapped a pair of handcuffs onto his wrists. The metal clicked loudly, the sound sharp in the tense air. People in the crowd hesitated before pulling out their phones, some recording the scene. Mills chuckled as he began leading the vendor toward the patrol car. Tanner patted him roughly on the shoulder. "You should have just packed up when we told you to." The vendor stayed silent, his posture not changing. His steps were calm, collected, and as they reached the car, he shook his head slightly, muttering under his breath, "All right, that's enough." The officers didn't know it yet, but in the next few moments their entire world was about to flip upside down. The officers led the vendor toward their patrol car, their grips firm on his arms. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He walked calmly, his expression unreadable. The crowd, now larger, stood watching in silence, their phones held up, capturing every second. The tension in the air was thick, an unspoken awareness that something was wrong, something about the vendor's complete lack of panic. He wasn't scared. He wasn't pleading. He was simply waiting, As they reached the car, Tanner opened the back door and placed a hand on the vendor's shoulder, ready to shove him inside. But before he could, the vendor let out a slow sigh, shook his head slightly, and said in a voice so calm it sent chills down Mills's spine, "All right, that's enough." Mills frowned. "What did you just say?" he snapped, tightening his grip. The vendor didn't answer right away. Instead, still restrained in handcuffs, he shifted slightly, reaching into his pocket. Tanner's instincts kicked in. His hand shot toward his holster. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he barked. The vendor's hand emerged, moving deliberately slow, and in his fingers he held a black and gold badge. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The badge gleamed under the streetlights, its polished surface catching the glow just enough for everyone around to see. The officers stared at it, their expressions twisting from amusement to pure confusion. The crowd gasped. A few people stepped closer, eyes widening as they realized what they were looking at. Tanner snatched the badge from the vendor's hand, his fingers gripping it tightly. He squinted at the words engraved on the front. Then his face drained of color. Mills, standing beside him, glanced over his shoulder, reading the words that had just changed everything. A long, deafening silence followed. Tanner blinked, his mouth opening slightly, but no words came out. He looked up at the vendor, his once smug, arrogant expression now replaced with something close to terror. Mills took a slow step back, his hands suddenly unsteady. His entire body stiffened as if the weight of the moment had just slammed into him. The vendor, still handcuffed, didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just looked at them, his voice firm and steady, as he dropped the bombshell that shattered everything. "You just arrested a federal agent." Tanner's breath hitched. Mills let out a strangled noise, a mix between a cough and a gasp. The vendor had barely spoken in the last 15 minutes, but now each word hit like a hammer. Mills' eyes darted to the crowd, to the dozens of phones pointed straight at them. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't just a bad arrest. This was a career-ending disaster. Tanner tried to find his voice, but panic had settled in. His grip on the badge tightened as if squeezing it would somehow make the words change, make it say something, anything, other than what it did. "This is a joke," Mills stammered, his face now pale. "Right?" "This is fake?" The vendor simply shook his head. "It's real." The weight of those words crushed them. A hush spread through the crowd, as if the entire city had paused to witness this moment. Every camera was recording, every person was watching. The vendor, once just a simple man behind a food cart, now stood before them as something else entirely. He was no longer a vendor, no longer someone to be ignored or pushed around. He was a federal agent, a man with real power. And they had just dragged him across the street, humiliated him, and thrown him into handcuffs like a criminal. Tanner finally forced himself to move. He let out a dry, nervous laugh, lifting his hands in a weak attempt to regain control of the situation. "Listen, buddy, this is just a—" "No," the vendor interrupted. His voice was still calm, but now there was an edge to it, something sharper. "This is an abuse of power." Tanner swallowed hard. "We didn't know—" "You didn't ask." Mills took another step back, his hands shaking slightly now. "Okay, look, we can talk about this, right? Let's be reasonable." The vendor tilted his head slightly. "Was I given that courtesy?" Mills opened his mouth, then closed it. The vendor took a slow step forward, and now it was the officers who backed away. "You want to know what's going to happen next?" the vendor asked, his voice even but firm. "I'll tell you." Tanner and Mills both stiffened. The vendor reached for his pocket again, this time pulling out his phone. He tapped the screen once, lifted it to his ear, and simply said, "It's me. Send them in." Tanner and Mills barely had a second to react before the sound of engines roared in the distance. Black SUVs, sleek and official, pulled up to the curb. Their doors swung open at the same time, and men in suits stepped out, their eyes scanning the scene. Tanner let out a shaky breath. Mills looked like he was about to faint. The vendor turned to them one last time, his eyes cold. "You're both under investigation." Tanner took a sharp inhale. "Wait, no. For misconduct, for abuse of power, and for making the worst mistake of your careers." Mills visibly swallowed. You can't do this." The vendor gave him a hard look. "Can't I?" Silence. The answer was clear. The men in suits approached. Tanner and Mills didn't move. They didn't resist. They didn't argue, because they knew it was over. And the last thing they heard before being led away was the vendor's calm, final words. "Now you know what it feels like to be powerless." Downfall? The vendor stood still, his posture straight, his eyes locked on the two officers in front of him. Moments ago, he had been just another street vendor in their eyes. Someone they could intimidate, control, and humiliate. But now they saw him for what he really was. A federal agent, a man with real power. Tanner and Mills were frozen in place. Their hands twitched slightly at their sides, their bodies tense. The confidence they once had was gone. The vendor's face, once calm and kind, was now cold and authoritative. He was no longer just standing there, he was commanding the space around him. Still handcuffed, he tilted his head slightly. "You're both in trouble," he said evenly. Tanner swallowed hard. This is a mistake," he stammered. "You should have told us who you were from the start." The vendor's eyes narrowed. "Should I have?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the thick tension like a blade. The officers had no response. The vendor exhaled through his nose and reached into his pocket once more, this time pulling out his phone. He pressed a button, lifted it to his ear, and spoke just 2 words. "Send them in." Tanner and Mills flinched as the sound of engines revving grew louder. Within seconds, 3 sleek black SUVs appeared from the end of the street, weaving through traffic and coming to a sharp stop in front of the scene. Their doors swung open at the same time, and men in dark suits stepped out, their expressions unreadable. The crowd, already holding their breath, gasped in shock. Tanner took a step back, bumping into Mills. Oh no. Mills' hands clenched. His face was pale, sweat forming on his forehead. He looked at the vendor, then at the approaching agents, then back at the vendor. "Wait, let's talk about this." The vendor finally moved, stepping forward. His voice was steady, unshaken. "You had no problem pushing me around a few minutes ago. Now you want to talk?" Mills opened his mouth, then closed it. He had nothing to say. The agents approached, standing beside the vendor. One of them, a tall man with sharp eyes, turned toward him. "Is this them?" he asked. The vendor nodded once. "Yes." Tanner took another step back, panic fully setting in now. "Look, this was just a misunderstanding." His voice cracked slightly, and he quickly tried to correct himself. "You were acting suspicious. How were we supposed to know who you were?" The vendor studied him for a long moment before shaking his head. "You didn't care who I was, because in your eyes, I was nobody." Mills' jaw clenched. He tried to steady his breathing, but his chest was rising and falling too fast. He turned to the lead agent. "Look, I get it, okay? Maybe we made a mistake, but does it really have to go this far?" The vendor's eyes darkened. He reached for his badge, held it in his hand, and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "You don't know how many officers I've watched do exactly what you did today. You see a vendor. You see a worker. and you think that means no one is watching. No one is holding you accountable. Mills's throat tightened. We didn't mean... The vendor lifted a hand, stopping him. I wasn't just standing behind a cart for fun. He let the words sink in. I was assigned to monitor this district, to document police misconduct, to collect proof. Tanner's body stiffened. His hands curled into weak fists. We didn't... You did exactly what I expected you to do. The vendor cut in. The moment you thought you had power over me, you used it. Without hesitation, Tanner and Mills visibly swallowed. Their heads hung slightly, their shoulders now slumped. The vendor finally turned toward the lead agent, handing over his badge. "Take them in." Tanner's face drained of color. "Wait." His voice was loud, desperate. "Come on, there's got to be another way." The lead agent nodded at his men. Within seconds, handcuffs clicked around both officers' wrists, the same handcuffs they had placed on the vendor just minutes ago. Mills gasped as he felt the metal tighten. This can't be happening. Tanner struggled slightly, but there was no escape. The moment the agents grabbed his arms, he knew it was over. The vendor watched them for a second longer, then let out a quiet breath. "Now you know what it feels like." Mills closed his eyes, his face twisting in regret. Tanner, who had spent years acting untouchable, suddenly looked small. And as the agents led them toward the black SUVs, the crowd parted, watching in stunned silence. Their careers were over. Their lives had just changed forever. And all because they had messed with the wrong man. The black SUVs rolled away, carrying officers Tanner and Mills toward an uncertain future. Just moments ago, they had been the ones in control, the ones who dictated how things worked on the streets. But now, with their hands bound in the very cuffs they had so carelessly slapped onto others, they sat in stunned silence, their worlds crumbling around them. The once arrogant smirks had vanished, replaced by vacant stares and sinking realization. They had abused their power for years, but today, power had turned its back on them. The news spread faster than they could comprehend. By the time they reached their holding facility, the world had already seen what happened. The video was everywhere, on social media, television, and news sites, capturing every moment of their humiliation. Two officers, blindly flexing their authority over a man they assumed was powerless, only to discover he was a CIA agent on an undercover mission. It wasn't just a bad arrest. It was the kind of career-ending mistake that people would talk about for years. The footage was damning, showing their aggression, their arrogance, and ultimately, their downfall. The headlines followed quickly. Police officers arrest undercover CIA agent regretted instantly. Power abuse backfires. Cops taken away in handcuffs. The biggest mistake of their careers caught on camera. The department scrambled to respond. At first, they attempted damage control, calling it a misunderstanding. But the public wasn't having it. Too many people had witnessed the truth. Calls for police reform flooded social media. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, demanding accountability. The officers passed complaints. Cases that had been brushed aside were suddenly being reviewed with fresh eyes. They weren't just suspended, they were under investigation. Everything they had done, every rule they had bent, every abuse of power they had gotten away with. It had all come back to haunt them. Meanwhile, the vendor, the man they had mocked, shoved, and arrested, stood quietly by his cart, watching as justice unfolded before him. The last SUV disappeared down the street, carrying away two officers who, moments ago, thought they were untouchable. He reached up and unfastened his apron, folding it neatly before placing it on the counter. His mission here was complete. He had spent months in this role, observing, waiting, collecting evidence. He had seen too many officers behave like Tanner and Mills, treating civilians like obstacles instead of people. But today, the lesson had been taught. There were consequences now. And this was only the beginning. As he turned toward the waiting black SUV, the other vendors and bystanders watched him with new eyes. He had been just another man in the crowd, working for his livelihood like the rest of them. But in a single moment, he had transformed into something more. A force of accountability, a symbol that power could no longer be abused without consequence. He didn't acknowledge the whispers, the glances of respect, or the recording phones. He simply climbed into the vehicle, and the door shut behind him. The vendor was gone. The agent remained, back at the precinct. The ripple effect of that day was undeniable. The atmosphere had shifted. The officers who remained sat stiffly at their desks, exchanging uneasy glances. Every single one of them had seen the video. Some of them had even laughed before, joked about how easy it was to push vendors around. But now, no one was laughing. Before, they had felt invincible, untouchable. They could harass, intimidate, and use their badges as shields, knowing there would be no consequences. But now they weren't so sure. The thought loomed over them. What if the next person they bullied wasn't just another vendor? What if they were being watched, tested, waiting for the right moment to strike back? The fear they had once instilled in others was now turned back on them. For Tanner and Mills, reality set in the moment they stepped into the cold, sterile walls of the interrogation room. The long wooden table, the single chair on either side, it was all too familiar. But this time, they weren't on the outside looking in. They were the ones sitting in the hot seat. For years, they had stood in rooms just like this, throwing accusations, controlling narratives, playing the system. But today, they had no control. Today, they were the ones being questioned. They sat in complete silence as an investigator read them their rights, the same rights they had read to so many others without a second thought. You have the right to remain silent. Those words had always been a formality to them, a phrase they had uttered mechanically. But today, it felt different. Today, it felt real. Mills exhaled shakily, rubbing a hand over his face. "We messed up," he whispered under his breath. Tanner didn't respond. He didn't have to. He knew it was over. Meanwhile, in the black SUV driving through the city streets, the the agent, sat with his arms crossed, watching the blurred skyline pass by. The voices of Tanner and Mills still echoed in his head, their taunts, their arrogance, their laughter. And then, the moment their voices cracked, the moment their confidence shattered, he had seen that moment before. And he knew he would see it again. Because Tanner and Mills weren't unique. There were dozens, hundreds more just like them. They had simply been the first ones to fall. But they wouldn't be the last. The agent had work to do. His job wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about changing the system itself. One by one, he would root them out. One by one, he would make them answer for their actions. Tanner and Mills had thought they could harass a man on the street without a second thought. Today, they had learned the truth. You never know who's watching. As the black SUV slowed to a stop in front of a secure facility, the agent stepped out, his mind already on his next assignment. He took one last look at the city behind him, the same city where he had stood behind a food cart just hours ago, playing the role of an ordinary vendor. But today, the city had changed. The people in it had changed. Because now, they knew. There were new rules. And those who once thought they were untouchable, They would never make that mistake again. The door to the building shut behind him. The city remained, but it would never be the same. As the agent disappeared into the building, the city behind him remained unchanged, but the people within it would never see law enforcement the same way again. Today, power shifted. The ones who thought they could abuse their authority without consequences learned a lesson they would never forget. Officers Tanner and Mills had spent years wielding their badges like weapons, believing they were untouchable. But in the end, their downfall proved one simple truth. Power isn't about a uniform. It's about integrity. Now the question is for you to decide. What do you think? Should those officers get a second chance? Or did they get what they deserved? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe in justice, accountability, and standing up against corruption, make sure to hit that like button and share this video. Let's make sure stories like this reach the world. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories where the truth always comes to light. Because in the end, one decision can change everything. See you in the next video.